Hello everybody and welcome to another sit down and chat video with a topic that I think is going to be a little bit controversial, but hopefully mostly interesting, enlightening, and will spark some healthy debate down in the comments section below. This is going to be a really interesting one, and I've got myself some little cue cards here to make sure I get these facts and figures right, because it's quite a numbers-heavy debate today. And we're going to be talking about the highly controversial and interesting topic of CO2, the environment, and all that good stuff. Now, this is a topic which, of course, gets people on both sides of the fence quite animated. And it creates a bit of internal conflict for me too, because I'm well aware of the fact that my hobby and now my career is driving cars, many of which are not particularly good for the environment, and I'm not blind to that fact. It's something I've been thinking about for quite some time. However, the solutions currently being presented, I don't think are really the right ones. And today, I don't really intend to provide any concrete answers, and in fact, if there is a solution to this big problem, I highly doubt it's going to come from a small, second-rate, slightly overweight YouTuber in the east of England. I am JayEmm on cars, not Professor Brian Cox, but I think talking about these things is a very healthy thing to do, and so that's all I really aim to achieve today. This discussion was inspired in part by the arrival of Extreme E, which, if you haven't heard about it, is a new motorsport that's trying to do things in a slightly different way. So it's a sort of short sprint races really, with interesting off-road electric cars that do look quite exciting and a lot of fun. It does things differently by not having crowds, so the whole thing's televised. People don't go to the locations. The locations themselves are somewhat unusual. They'll try and pick places which have suffered in some way, shape or form from climate change over the past few years, and trying to highlight awareness and raise the issue of climate change in the motorsports arena, which I think is a very difficult and delicate thing to do, and I think can lead to some accusations of hypocrisy from some others, because you've got people who've spent their career and made all their money by driving these cars all around the world constantly, and now they're saying, hey, you should be going electric, and here's proof why. But I get a bit of a problem with this. You see, I started doing some research because, yeah, sure, Extreme E has electric cars, but a lot of the rest of the operation isn't zero emissions. It's just not. Now, they try and offset that, and we're going to get onto that in a little bit, but I started wondering, well, how much pollution does Formula One actually create? As top flight, top level motorsport, I looked into it, and an official figure from not too long ago was that Formula One thinks it produces around 256,000 tonnes of CO2 per year. Now, that doesn't include the amount generated by fans who are travelling to see the race, and this is Formula One itself. If it ran the same way as Extreme E, televised only, that's roughly what it would be creating. But here's the kicker, right? Here's the thing that sparked this particular video. Of that figure, that 256,000 tonnes, less than 1% is actually the emissions of the cars doing the racing. So it's the tiniest proportion. So from my perspective, Extreme E is already sort of invalidated as an experiment, because the cars themselves were never really responsible for that much in terms of emissions. In fact, I would very much like to see a document, and I'm sure it probably doesn't exist, looking at the cost of creating an Extreme E car versus the cost of creating a Formula One car, purely in terms of CO2 output, because we know fairly well that creating electric cars does involve making more CO2 than a Formula One car, or a regular car, I should say. So I'd be curious to see how much better really the cars themselves are than F1 cars. I'm sure they do wind up being better. I mean, Extreme E races do not last very long at all, and that's one problem for me, is that it's just not that exciting as a spectacle. I've seen some interesting racing and some exciting moments from it, but overall, I don't think it's really going to last all that long. So, if these CO2 numbers are a little bit meaningless for you, allow me to give you some context. So, Formula One, 256,000 tonnes a year. The average UK household is about 17 tonnes a year. If you were to drive 10,000 miles in, let's say, for example, a 2014 Vauxhall Mocha diesel, and I've chosen that because it's a car that I think is accessible to pretty much most people, probably most people watching this, and it came from before the emissions regs were really tightened, sort of a few years ago. So it's a very good average car. And 10,000 miles in that will create 2 tonnes of CO2 emission. If you wanted to do the same mileage, 10,000 miles, in a Ferrari F8 Tributo, you're looking at just shy of 5 tonnes, about 4.7. Building A new Polestar 2 will involve 26.2 tons of CO2 being produced. So in other words, building a Polestar 2 takes the same amount of CO2 as driving a Ferrari F8 for about 50,000 miles. And I expect very, very few people will ever drive their F8 for that amount of time. Of course, building a regular car isn't CO2 free either, and Polestar themselves say that building something comparable to a Polestar 2 would involve about 16 tons of CO2. So there's a 10 ton of CO2 sort of uplift to create an electric car. However, the car industry, as these things go, are frankly amateurs when it comes to producing CO2. Here are some really, really scary numbers. It took a long time to work out what amount of CO2 a flight produces. There are lots and lots of websites out there which will help you calculate your own personal CO2 cost, and there will be websites that help you calculate your CO2 cost for flights. But they'll give you your CO2 cost. They'll go, oh, you, one person on this flight, here's how much CO2 you produced. But to me, that's a bit flawed, because if that plane's got 5 people on it or 200 people on it, it's probably going to produce broadly the same amount of CO2. So I don't think the sort of per person thing is a very helpful figure in the context of this video. However, I had to do a little bit of searching, digging around, workouts and things, and the figure I've arrived at, and please, if I'm wrong, someone in the comments tell me, is that a flight from London Heathrow to LAX, which I've done a number of times, is about 131 tons each way. In other words, about the same as 8 UK households will put out over a year. It's a lot, right? But again, even this, that is less CO2 that is used, roughly. This one is a little bit difficult to work out. That's less CO2 used, we think, when Cristiano Ronaldo puts a post on Instagram. The energy cost of him putting a post on Instagram, as I believe one of Instagram's biggest people, most subscribed accounts, the energy cost of him putting a post out is absolutely enormous. But even Ronaldo can't come close to Bitcoin. Okay, so to give you an idea, a season of Formula One racing, 256,000 tons of CO2. Formula One, evil, the devil, killing the planet, nasty, boo, hiss, etc., etc. Bitcoin, 37 million tons of CO2 per year. Just to put that into some context again, that's about the same CO2 output as New Zealand. Ridiculous, right? Why is that? Well, in short terms, it's because the way that Bitcoin works, it requires a huge amount of processing power and therefore electricity to record transactions, make sure nothing fraudulent happens. It's this blockchain tech that they use. Very complicated, very clever. I only just about understand it on a surface level, but a huge amount of computing power is required to make Bitcoin work. And that's why it's really, really expensive in terms of environmental cost. And I don't think there's really an easy solution to that one. But again, Bitcoin only creates about half of the amount of CO2 as all of the domestic appliances in the United States of America, which are not currently in use. Yep. So Bitcoin is responsible for half the amount of CO2 as all the microwaves, TVs and everything in America that are on standby. I mean, I knew that electronics on standby obviously were a bit of a problem, and probably on a sort of household per household basis, they contribute very, very little. But when you realise the amount of things you have in your house just sat there doing nothing but still drawing electricity, this all adds up once you've got several 100 million people. That's scary. Just to sort of, again, bring this back, put some context to it, all of the microwaves and TVs and things in America sitting there basically being glorified clocks, well, for the CO2 that they cost, you could run the Formula One season 289 times. Yep. Then we get into the big dogs, container ships. They burn bunker fuel, which is essentially dragged out of the depths of hell. It's nasty. Look it up. It's absolutely horrendous stuff. It's basically just sort of, well, tar. It's awful. And it doesn't just chuck out CO2, it chucks out everything. I'm aware, by the way, that CO2 is far from the only pollutant, and in recent times we've talked about things like NOx, because that's also not very good, and particularly for children in cities, and we'll get onto that a little bit more soon. But CO2 is kind of the figure that everybody likes to pick. They like to demonize it. They like to talk about that one. So that's why I've used it for this, and it's fairly easy to get CO2 figures. Now, apparently, and I've seen this published in quite a few different places, enough places that I do tend to believe it, the 15 largest container ships in the world produce the same emissions as all of the cars. All of them. It's kind of hard to believe, isn't it? But honestly, please, once you've finished watching this video, go and look it up and see if it's true, because I'm pretty sure that it is. International shipping as a pollutant ranks about the same as Germany. And that's before you take into account all those ships where the front fell off and they essentially just did a big poo straight into the environment. So that's not very good, is it? And with numbers like these, you suddenly sort of see some hilarity in the idea of Formula One trying to reduce its CO2 output by making the engines in the cars ever so slightly smaller. To me, that seems like trying to stop a hurricane by farting in its general direction. It's just not going to do anything, is it? Sure, yes, a lot of small changes will add up to a large one, but I think we've just been going the wrong way about it. And for some reason, maybe it's because they're such a public-facing thing and already hated for many other reasons, but cars have really become the easy enemy, the face of global warming. But the fact is, it's pretty galling when places like Heathrow regularly miss their targets for air and noise pollution and seem to get away scot-free, yet apparently you have to chop in your car for an electric one tomorrow, or you'll be shot. That's a little bit upsetting. So now we've got plenty of context, I can finally talk about the meaty bit of this video, which is why I feel that zero emissions is the great con of the 21st century. And don't worry, I'm not going to launch into some crazed right-wing tirade about fake news, the woke left, vaccines and all that stuff. I actually had my second one yesterday and I've been absolutely fine. Unless you turn the microwave on in 6 feet of me and then I'll wake up 2 hours later covered in vomit. But other than that, I'm absolutely fine. No, I think actually this is probably going to be a somewhat less controversial thing than people expect, but hear me out. So, I think zero emissions is a horrible thing to aim for, and here are some of my reasons why. Firstly, I'm not sure for any point in the near future zero emissions is actually going to be possible. Not for a very, very long time. The mere act of turning on my camera to be able to record this video, I will have created at some point, somehow, some emissions. The batteries that I have to power it will have created some emissions. The computer that's on currently, showing me all of my notes, that is currently drawing electricity out of the grid. Emissions will be created somewhere. Building a lovely, nice new electric car creates CO2. Making a defibrillator that could save somebody's life is going to involve the creation of some CO2. There's just no real way to eliminate the production of CO2 in what we do. And quite frankly, CO2 is actually a very important part of the environment. Anyone that studied sort of, fairly basic stuff at school will know that CO2 does have a role to play. If we got rid of it entirely, I think the planet would probably have some very, very large problems. And we have proven time and time again that when it comes to doing anything remotely responsible, all big business and government will always find a way to fudge the numbers. That's just what they do. This is why you've been told to buy an electric car, and the shipping companies have a license to just commit basically, environmental murder and get away with it scot-free. That's just how it is. They love placing responsibility onto you, the small person who actually has fairly limited powers, and great big organisations that just happen to sort of, have the PM's phone number. They can do whatever they like. So I just think that's not very helpful. But by trying to claim that things are zero emissions when they really obviously aren't, you cannot call an electric car, I think, zero emissions, because that to me implies that no emissions were ever created by that vehicle, which simply aren't true. And by pretending that that's the truth, you really don't actually help anything in the long term. And we haven't then therefore solved anything. So let me ask you a simple question. If I said to you that you could go and watch the Formula One race, but it was going to cost you an extra 10 quid a ticket. However, for that price, we could have the V12s back. Would you pay it? I'm pretty sure, because you're watching this channel, you'd probably say, abso-bleeding-lutely, wouldn't that be fantastic? They sounded so much better, the racing was so much more exciting. Yes, go on, do that, let's have that, 10 quid, happily pay that twice. And I would as well. So to me, the real secret of not just sustainability, but a future where everybody from all sides of this argument can get along is not going after zero emissions like a dog trying to chase its own tail, but instead going for carbon neutrality. You see, zero emission vehicles are definitely going to be a part of their future, and I welcome them. There are many scenarios where we definitely need them. City centre pollution is a big problem. All buses in London should be electric. The hybrid ones are a bit of an oddity because I've never really noticed a hybrid bus driving past me on electric power. Why is it that they haven't introduced a law saying, okay, yeah, all taxis in London must be electric? Because that to me would be sensible. Yeah, sure, okay, it's going to cost some money, but we're banning all normal cars soon anyway, so why in city centres haven't we already said that all of these vehicles need to be electric? If the government want to lead by example, they'd already have made fire engines electric, they would have made ambulances electric, they would have made police cars electric, except all of these different divisions of government know that actually the cost of doing so is so enormous they can't afford to do it, and in many cases the vehicles don't yet actually exist to be able to do that role successfully. Yet the rest of us are all expected to be able to change over to electric with, no harm to what we do at all. And that's just unrealistic and unhelpful. And it's unhelpful for the manufacturers as well, because they're being pushed to create things which I think they're just not ready for. Audi have something like 50 cars in their lineup, and they're expected within 9 years to be able to have turned all of them into some sort of electric car. And I just don't think we can do that. I don't think there's the time. I just don't, especially with what's happened in the last year. A lot of companies are down on money, they're down on time, and the dates haven't changed. We're still expected in 9 years to not be able to buy petrol or diesel engined cars anymore. I just don't think it's realistic. I just don't. But manufacturers, as long as they're being told that's still the case, they have to try and go for that. I just don't think it's going to work. I love the idea of carbon neutrality as the goal, because I think I've explained fairly well, zero emissions I think is unachievable, but carbon neutrality actually I think is not just practical, but very, very simple too. I got thinking the other day, and I was wondering, there must be a way of offsetting my CO2 output. There must be an easy way of just going somewhere and saying to someone, can I give you some money? Can you plant some trees in my name? And I am going to be doing my bit for the environment and undoing the damage I'm inevitably doing by driving my cars around all the time. Well, it turns out there are a whole bunch of companies out there that will do exactly that. I looked through a few of them. Now, I picked one called Neutral Ignition, not sponsors of this video at all. I just found the website and it's quite easy to use. And if you go on the website, it will basically ask you for your car's registration number and how many miles a year that you do. So I thought, okay, I drive a lot of different cars a year. I picked the 430 Scuderia, because I thought, actually, it's above average as CO2 emissions go, but probably sort of fairly representative of the wider mix of stuff that I drive. I wanted to be on the pessimistic side of this if I could. And then said, okay, 50,000 miles a year. I maybe don't drive quite as much as that, but that should definitely cover me. And the cost of offsetting all my CO2 for a year, 500 quid. That was it. I mean, I basically screamed. It was like not just a light bulb turning on above my head, but the thing just exploded. There's, imaginary glass all over the place. I'm going to have to get the imaginary broom out later and sweep up all the shards. And I was just, hang on a minute, £500 for me, a very, very, big generator of CO2. It was 30 tons of CO2. Essentially is what I was offsetting. So, double more or less the annual UK average household's worth of CO2 just from my driving. And I thought, well, that's nowhere near as much as I expected it to be. There are even several ways that you could offset your CO2. You could have forests planted in your name. There are different projects around the world. You can invest in peatland in Scotland, which is quite an interesting one to look into. There's some companies that will help replant the lowlands and try and turn Scotland to look back like it should do, which is actually more foresty than the image you have of Scotland. So that was kind of amazing. And I've done some numbers as well for probably more real world cases, because not everybody's going to be doing that kind of mileage in that kind of car. So that aforementioned Vauxhall Mocha diesel, CO2 for a year, 50 quid to offset that. Same mileage in a 996 generation 911 is £105, which is just, I just don't get it. Like, what's being proposed as the solution to this problem in the name of the environment? And let's remember here, this is in the name of the environment. they're trying to build millions, probably tens or hundreds of millions of pure electric vehicles, which there's still some debate as to how realistic or feasible that is, to try and stop this problem. And then when you realise that actually so many people don't really do that many miles in their car, the cost of building these new cars has a real toll as well on the environment and everything else, and financial too. EVs are really expensive. The cost of offsetting all of this is so low. I mean, 500 quid is less than I pay for a year's worth of road fund license in some of my cars. It's very, very little. You know, a really cheap car to tax is like 30 quid. I know it's not really tax, but you know what I mean. So it's just a little bit odd, really, isn't it? So, yeah, I picked CO2, like I said before. You know, people always love to sort of hang on to this one figure, and it doesn't tell a full picture. It simply doesn't. You know, this is the same with all walks of life. I mean, if I give you the horsepower figure for a car, you know, I could say, this car's 400 horsepower. Now, it might actually not really be that fast, or it might be unbelievably quick, faster than you've ever driven, because you need to know, well, how much does it weigh? You know, where is the engine? Is it all-wheel drive? Is it front-wheel drive? Is it rear-wheel drive? There are so many other things that go into making the actual car perform in the way that it does. The horsepower figure is actually only one fairly small piece of it. You know, what's the torque? All that stuff. I had it with cameras as well for years and years, and still to some extent people got obsessed with megapixel numbers, and they got higher and higher and higher, and actually in many cases we were making picture quality worse. But because we'd educated the public into thinking that more megapixels equaled better, that's just what companies strove for, and we actually wound up doing more harm than good in terms of image quality. Well, CO2, I think, is not quite equivalent to that, but you get what I'm getting at here. It's one number that we've latched onto and have become so obsessed about, I think we're just losing sight of the bigger picture. And what we really need is this sort of more holistic approach, a more sort of considered, careful approach. I mean, like I've said many times on this channel, and even in this video before, I do agree that inner city pollution is a problem. I don't mind the congestion charge in the ULEZ zone in London being extended, because guess what? I don't want to drive my old Ferrari into the middle of London. I don't. I do have some concerns that there are some people who are being unfairly punished by this because of the way, you know, it's a flat rate fee. So people that do have very low income and can't afford new cars are being punished unfairly, and this is a social inequality. There's a lot of social injustice with the whole EV thing. I mean, I do get a little bit frustrated when you see many of these racing drivers out there telling everybody that, you know, they're on Mount Pius and they're not going to be driving their old polluting petrol cars on the road anymore. You know, they've got these new electric cars, and sometimes I think they really do lose sight of the big picture, really, that not everybody can just afford to just casually hop out and buy themselves a Tesla. It's just not realistic. But when the cost of going carbon neutral is so low and is actually so affordable to so many, why isn't that the thing that we're promoting? It just seems a little bit mad. You know, I chose motorsport for this discussion for that very reason. You know, there's so many of these guys out there trying to promote the electric car bit. And yeah, it's great. I want to see electric cars developed. It's very important. I think they are going to be a big part of our future. But I don't think they're going to be the only part of our motoring future. I just don't. You know, I see this glorious world where, you know, a 430 Scuderia can share the road with a Tesla, with a Kia EV6. And we can all do our bit for the planet. We can just appreciate and acknowledge that sometimes some of these things we want to do will involve generating a bit of emissions, and there are things we can do to offset that. You know, let's stop pretending that, you know, it's a harmless thing, but we can fix it. I guess it's like, you know, whenever anyone talks about going on a diet, very, very few people actually say, right, okay, that's it. You're never going to have any fun ever. They always talk about doing things in moderation, or, you know, you see bodybuilders, they'll have their cheat day. You know, someone's going out there, you know, doing the thing. You know, you'll see Arnie or whoever, you're having a stack of pancakes that big. Now he's not going to do that every day, but he's doing that because he goes, okay, well, you know, I've spent all week training, and on this day I'm going to have loads of fun. And it's very much the same thing. It's all about balance, isn't it? You know, that's the real key thing here. It's about balance and a realistic approach to solving a fairly big and important problem. And it just baffles me that some fairly seemingly obvious solutions are out there that we can sort of start working on now for a very reasonable price, and yet we don't seem to be promoting those. Maybe it's because there's not billions to be made by replanting forests and doing the right thing. Maybe the whole EV industry is just far too lucrative for some out there, that this is why governments are promoting it, because they've decided that more money can be made by all of their mates by telling everyone that their cars are illegal now, so you have to get something else. And I think it's quite sad, because actually everybody loses in that scenario, don't they? Us petrol heads don't get to enjoy our lovely old cars. People that do care about the environment will realise that actually we haven't really saved it at all. We've just fudged the numbers and tried to make it look good when actually it wasn't good. It's all a bit of a mess, really. I also think one of the best things about going for carbon neutrality as a goal is that will encourage people to think about where they generate their carbon, how they generate their carbon, because then they're going to be just that little bit more conscious about the whole thing. And then they'll realise, like, oh, actually, you know, I can save a little bit of carbon if I take this car today rather than that, and it'll maybe cost me a little bit less money. Or they'll just go, yeah, you know what, I'm taking the Ferrari, it's going to cost me extra £3 to offset it, don't care, going to have a great time. And that, I think, it just makes sense. I am in a very fortunate position that I earn quite a bit of money now off of talking about cars and driving them around, and I get paid enough that I can offset all of that CO2 that I've generated. Today's ad placement money is going to go directly towards doing that, and with that I'll be able to offset a couple of years worth of CO2 emissions, and it's an amount that I'm happy to continue paying, because I personally feel it's the right thing to do. It's at a price that I think is acceptable, and if I happen to make Scotland look a little bit greener and leafier, that's a great thing too. I think everybody wins there. Why governments aren't promoting this kind of thing more, I don't know. But perhaps saving the planet the right way doesn't make enough money. That would be me being a little bit cynical and conspiracy theorist, wouldn't it? We don't want to do any of that. No. So anyway, there's a bit of waffle from me. I'm sure it's going to be a very lively comment section. So I shall now pop down into there and have a chat with all of you and see what you think. Cheers for watching. Bye-bye.